After nearly 30 years, Sonic the Fighters is on its way to Combo Breaker 2024, and later this year, CEO 2024, where dozens of players will be duking it out in what might be the biggest tournaments the game has ever seen. And that's awesome. Sonic the Fighters is a game where new players can start engaging in the back and forth, meat and potatoes elements of it rather quickly. But that said, there's a lot going on under the hood in this game that is less well understood than in many other games, especially for newer players. Ever since this past December, I've been playing this game a lot, and in that time, I've gotten a lot better at it. And I've also seen a lot of other new players take up the game and run into the same issues over and over. With that in mind, I thought I would shine a light at some of the intricacies of this game that often serve as obstacles for players hoping to improve at it. So first off, let's just get over the basics. This is a 3-button game, those buttons being punch, kick, and block. Although most modern setups for the game will also allow you to bind other buttons as macros. This game is a 3D fighter in the vein of Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers, with standard fighting game options like short hopping and full jumping, dashing forward and backwards, throws, and motion inputs. This video will go over some character-specific strategies, but will mostly be a non-comprehensive mechanical overview, focusing on some of the less intuitive aspects of the game that can trip up new and experienced players. Also, if you do want to play other people in this game, this video will link the STF Discord and videos on how to set the game up on the RPCS3 PS3 emulator, which is currently the game's most popular platform. So yeah, without further ado, let's talk about Sonic the Fighters. And to start off, let's talk about how the game handles blocking. When it comes to something like blocking, to the unseasoned player, Sonic the Fighters can feel a little bit like the midpoint of something like Smash and something like Virtua Fighter. Like in both of those games, blocking in STF is not done by holding back, but instead by using a dedicated button input. Press this button to put up what the game calls a barrier. Sonic the Fighters barriers in general will protect you from just about anything that comes your way, and can be deployed very quickly. That said, they do carry a downside. Like in most fighting games, you can get grabbed out of block in STF, but barriers can also be broken, setting up the mechanic's main hook. In the default rule set of Sonic the Fighters, players begin a match with access to 5 barriers that do not regenerate between rounds. Run out of barriers and you will lose the ability to block altogether. So how do we avoid this? Unlike Smash's shield break mechanic, barriers are broken only by specific moves. Oftentimes these moves will be jab string enders, spin dashes, moves with longer startup, and any and all throws. It makes sense to not block these moves and instead dodge them if possible. Although moves that do break barriers often will leave the attacking player at a frame disadvantage, meaning that depending on the circumstances, blocking a move that breaks your barrier could still be worth it. Games in STF go fast, so it makes sense to use the resources that you're allotted. That said, defending is only one of the things you can do with your barrier. By holding back while pressing punch and kick together, players can sacrifice a barrier to enter Hyper Mode, the closest thing STF has to a fighting game super. For a short period of time, Hyper Mode allows you to near instantly chain moves into each other, as if your character was a tape being fast-forwarded. While in Hyper Mode, players can do something that's rare in regular gameplay: combo, with many of the flashiest clips to come out of the game being custom-built Hyper Mode sequences. Players in Hyper Mode cannot break barriers, but if a player does try to block an opponent's Hyper combo, they'll usually find themselves stuck in their block, unable to move and vulnerable to throws. When they're not pulling off silly custom combos, players in Hyper Mode can also use some exclusive moves like Sonic's Emerald Dive and Bean and Espio's Warp, or use amped up versions of existing moves like Amy's 16-ton variant of Heads Up. Damage dealt while in Hyper Mode is reduced pretty significantly, and also does not have catch-up damage scaling, but players can work around that a bit by ending their Hyper Mode strings with hard-hitting moves or throws. Ending your combo with a link into a throw will help ensure that the last hit of your sequence will happen after Hyper Mode and its included damage nerf has expired. Using Hyper Mode then is what more aggressive players may find themselves choosing to do with their barriers rather than blocking, as movement options and sidesteps are often strong enough in this game to do what barriers do anyway. For beginner players, running out of barriers can often spell their doom, but some of the game's more experienced players will deliberately throw them away. Why? 2 words: non-hyper, hyper start. Hyper start, the move that players use to initiate Hyper Mode, is more than just a little animation. It's actually an attack, and not a bad one, launching opponents and coming out on frame 11. For many characters, it's their fastest front-facing normal. although its range is very small. Using it in hyper mode, it can be a nice move to throw into your combos, but the move is arguably at its most useful when the player using it is out of barriers. When out of barriers, players get to use non-hyper start, which is the same move but used without being in hyper mode. And for some characters, depending on who they're fighting, throwing away barriers to have access to this move is worth it. Non-hyper start is a great option when you need to have a hitbox out as soon as possible, say after hitting someone's barrier or just in a scrappy situation. If your opponent blocks it, it can break barriers while also having pretty low recovery time. In certain spots, it will also link into itself, and its damage output isn't bad either. For Tails, Honey, and Bean, the move is just a little bit more useful because due to the shape of these characters' heads of all things, the move tends to have a little bit more range to it. With Honey in particular being a character who can live and die by her sidestep and only needs to block on special occasions, throwing away barriers in order to sooner access her non-hyper start is a totally legitimate strategy. That said, as a beginner, don't be afraid to block. Often throwing out your barrier in the middle of getting hit by your opponent's punch or kick strings will allow you to turn a situation around and in your favor. Just remember that, like in most fighting games, your blocks can still be read with throws, and in addition, know that due to the power of air teching in this game, some moves can actually be safer on block than they are on hit. That should cover the basics of barrier management in Sonic the Fighters, but the real STF freaks in the audience should know that you don't actually have to be grounded to use Hyperstart. Activated by holding up in midair while pressing P and K, Air Hyperstart both activates Hyper Mode and has a hitbox on the way down. The non-hyper variant of this move is really good too, and can set up juggles, with top players often jumping with air kicks on the way up and Air Hyperstart on the way down. Also, one more thing regarding non-hyper Hyperstart, it should be noted that you don't actually have to be out of barriers to use it. When a character exits Hyper Mode, they actually enter a short cooldown period where they cannot activate Hyper Mode again, even if they still have barriers. Characters will only be able to use the non-hyper version of Hyperstart when this happens until the cooldown period for entering Hyper Mode ends. Okay, now that you know about barriers, let me tell you about sidesteps. In September of 1996, around 3 months after the release of Sonic the Fighters, Virtua Fighter 3 would introduce to its series the game-changing dodge button, adding 3D sidesteps to the series in a move that would forever change not only VF, but arguably 3D fighters at large. But if Virtua Fighter 3 was that mechanic's larger exposure to fighting games, Sonic the Fighters was that mechanic's testing ground.
Oh no!
Sidestepping, despite its ubiquity in Sonic the Fighters, is not always well understood by players. Activated by pressing the game's punch, kick, and barrier buttons together, use the input on its own to move in the direction of your character's back foot. Use the input while holding forward to sidestep in the direction of your character's front foot. Out of a sidestep, players can use sidestep punches, which are sometimes just the first hit of a character's jab string, and sometimes are bespoke moves. Players can also kick out of a sidestep, usually with a move that is known as skip kick. Hold up while pressing punch to do a body dive, and out of an initial sidestep, players can input a second sidestep. Attempting to input a third sidestep in a row will result in a player being forced to sidestep punch. In order to truly make the most out of their sidesteps, players should really focus on using the forward pressing form of the move, which infamously has invincibility frames that can allow players to dodge things that frankly their characters have no business dodging. How does this work? Well, roughly, when a player inputs an initial sidestep, the game will check if an attack or grab has been input by their opponent. And if so, the game gives the sidestepping player the technique's dodging variant. On all of the game's legal characters, these dodging sidesteps offer 12 invincibility frames when used while pressing forward. All dodging sidesteps, in addition, will go further and give the dodging player fewer recovery frames at the end of the sidestep. This is a lot of information to take in, but in essence, know that holding forward sidesteps are the ones that will likely give you the most bang for your buck, and that sidestepping once is generally better than sidestepping twice, and that your sidesteps are stronger if your opponent is attempting to attack when you use them. With all of this said, what do you do after sidestepping? For now, let's focus on sidestep punches, which as stated earlier, are sometimes bespoke moves and sometimes standard standing punches. Of the characters whose sidestep punches are their own unique moves, some, like Sonic's, which allows him to hit opponents from across the stage with a quicker version of his spin dash, are extremely strong and can break barriers. Others can be used to help characters get around things they might otherwise struggle with. Bean's projectiles are easy to block, but his sidestep punch will break barriers. Bark's sidestep punch has the same effect as his 2P, putting his opponent into what the community likes to call wimpy mode, a squashed form where players can only move forward, backwards, jump, and attack for up to 3 seconds. These moves are useful, no doubt, but arguably, the best sidestep punches in Sonic the Fighters are also the least unique ones. Honey, Knuckles, and Tails can use Sidestep P to simply use their regular standing punches. And for these characters, attacking out of Sidestep can set up some of their favorite positions, as after they use their initial punch, they can also execute a punch string, or if they're feeling frisky, punch kick. Punch kick is perhaps the strongest 2-move string in the game, a fast link with a second hit that has both a surprising amount of tracking and damage scaling with catch-up. It also forces opponents into one of the game's most difficult tech situations. Hit a punch kick in the corner and your opponent will collide against the wall in a way that often sets up high damage air kicks. Use it against a blocking opponent and you'll be safe enough to sidestep away before your opponent can hit you back. If your opponent dodges the punch, oftentimes they'll still get hit by the kick. Combine this technique with Knuckles and Honey's elongated forward lunging sidesteps, and their incredible offensive game reveals itself quickly. Tails, with his stubby stature and more ordinary sidesteps, will have to at least close space first before his PKs can really be used, but once he does, he's a menace. Sidestep punch kick is not only good, it's also pretty easy to pull off. And once players get the rhythm down, Honey and Knuckles mirror matches will often devolve simply into punch kick versus punch kick. With all that said, Sonic the Fighters is a game where you will have to play neutral. And even if sidestep punch kick spam can carry you through many matches, you probably should learn to do other things out of sidestep too. Sidestep kicks are, for the majority of characters, the universal move skip kick. Against opponents who are spamming spin dashes, this move is most likely the easiest way to counter them. By pressing kick a second time after skip kicking, you can also extend the move into a second skip kick. This can work well to punish opponents who are blocking, trying to grab or hit you after your first skip kick collides with their barrier. On the other hand, if your opponent is expecting you to use 2 skip kicks and punish afterwards, you can try using 1 skip kick and throwing them before they're able to react. The other attack players can use out of sidestep is the body splash. These moves are a bit more risky, although they can close space very well. They do tend to be unsafe on hit, especially if teched, so save their use for situations where you know they'll be worth using. While all of these options can be input midway into your sidestep, sometimes it might be better to hold off and wait until your sidestep ends and your character becomes stationary to act. This can be especially true if you did input your sidestep while your opponent was using an attack or throw, as the dodging variant of your sidestep also has a quicker animation that can open up options once your sidestep ends, like throws, regular jumps, dashes, and more, that might end up having more utility than a sidestep punch or skip kick. That's a basic overview of how you can utilize sidesteps as a tool, but what's the best way to contest them? That can be a difficult question, especially against some characters, but remember that the same things that make sidestep strong against opponents inputting attacks can also be used to contest them. By deliberately delaying strikes or throws, you can catch a preemptive sidestep by not allowing your opponent to have access to the technique's dodging variant. Command grabs like Foot Crush can work well here, with the command inputs helping stagger the input of your throw ever so slightly behind your opponent's sidestep input. With sidesteps overtuned as they are, however, you might also just want to fight fire with fire. By delaying your own sidestep, you can potentially catch your opponent's aggressive out of sidestep options and dodge them while getting a free neutral win of your own. Using basic movement options without attacking can also bait out a sidestep. If you jump out of the way of a punch kick, for example, you can use the lingering nature of the kick to give yourself a free dodging sidestep and counter hit. Whether or not you can dodge a sidestep attack, or what method you should dodge them in, of course, may differ. Short hopping away from punch kick might make sense in center stage, but in the corner, you might instead want to go for a wall jump. It should also be reiterated that while initial sidesteps can be very safe, double sidesteps have far less utility, and can be easily hit by moves that cover large areas like Bark's Lariat. So against players who seem to be mashing the sidestep input, calling out that second step can be a pretty simple counter. Finally, depending on who you're fighting, sometimes the best way to contest a sidestep is just to block. Sidestep punch kicks are generally pretty safe against blocking opponents, but most sidestep punches are not. Meaning, depending on the situation, if your opponent is sidestepping, it might be best to simply block and counter hit. So yeah, while playing a bigger role in some characters' game plans than others, sidestepping is an essential tool in Sonic the Fighters. and the better you understand it, the better you'll probably play. GG's. This character is brain dead. If there's a mechanic that defines and distinguishes Sonic the Fighters as a fighting game that isn't sidestepping, it might just be the game's safe land system, often referred to by players as air teching or simply teching. Basically, when a character is launched by an attack or throw, they can press punch, kick, and block at the same time to flip out of stun and quickly become actionable while still in the air. Doing this will both prevent the teching player from falling victim to easy follow-ups on hits, as well as prevent the teching player from being put into knockdown when they land. One thing that might not be clear to new players, however, is that there's actually multiple ways to tech a hit. If you tech with no directional input, you'll end up going straight back down to the ground. Hold back while teching to move yourself away from the hit, hold forward while teching to cancel out your horizontal momentum, and hold up while teching to, in essence, perform a mid-air jump. You're actionable after a tech as if you had jumped. As a result, characters that can spin dash can often land simple counter hits by teching up and then landing with air spin. Similarly, Bean can counter hit from a tech with a landing bomb, and Amy and Bark can both find counter hits by landing with air hammer and fist drop respectively. Out of a tech, all characters but Bark can also use air hyper start, which both allows players to land with an active hitbox and at the same time activates hyper mode. All in all, teching can be a pretty expressive tool in your gameplay. Bean with his bombs is the only character in Sonic the Fighters who can hurt himself. And while this seems like a bad thing on paper, and sometimes it is, Bean's bombs being a low damage option that can also initiate a tech situation, allow him to, if need be, bomb himself in order to initiate a tech, and then use a backwards tech to jump to a different part of the ring very quickly. While teching is strong, it does come with a downside. When you use this technique, it does not mean that you are immune to follow-up hits. And while in order to do so, players will often need to guess the direction and timing of your tech, it can be particularly dangerous when your techs are called out, as you will take more damage if you're intercepted before landing from a tech than if you had not teched at all. Indeed, another common slip-up from newer players to Sonic the Fighters can come from teching things too much. In some cases, like against non-hyper hyperstart spam or Bark's Hyper Lariat, overzealous teching can actually elongate a combo and all but seal your fate. Sometimes, it's better to just take the knockdown and avoid the extra damage. The strength of teching in Sonic the Fighters essentially makes it so a lot of attacks are not safe on hit. And this impacts not only moves used in neutral, but even moves used out of tech, such as descending air spins. Yes, in Sonic the Fighters, even the counter hits have counter hits, so choose your moves and techs carefully. Okay, that was a lot of talk about defensive techniques, so let's talk about grabs and throws. Sonic the Fighters is a game with few real combos, where many characters have to close space in order to win. And while STF strikes can be very strong, many of the game's strongest moves are throws and command grabs. On the outset, Bark appears to be the game's designated grappler, but the truth is, there isn't a single character in this game whose throws don't play a big role in their gameplay. Grappling serves double duty in this game as the offensive answer to both sidestepping and blocking, so grabs and throws are an essential part of any player's toolkit. All characters in STF have a default throw by pressing punch and block, and most characters have access to another grab of sort, Foot Crush, by double pressing down alongside kick and block. There are additional, more complicated command throws, and Slip Around is a universal move also classified as a throw in-game, but for now, let's focus on the more basic throws. As I said earlier, throws are very strong in STF. They do a lot of damage generally, often even more with catch-up, and they often also result in untechable knockdown states. Because true combos in this game are rare, and many of them begin with throws in the first place, there's not really many situations in this game where you would want to, quote, just take the throw. So then, how do you not get thrown? Well, if you and your opponent both input a throw at the same time, your throws will cancel each other out. To avoid throws more generally, however, you can jump or crouch, or have your back to your opponent, as this game does not have back grabs. Turning your back on command is something only Sonic and Tails can do, but all characters but Bark and Eggman can crouch, and everyone can jump. While the action of going from standing to crouching comes with an animation, you're actually considered to be crouching the moment your down input is read by the game. and if your opponent whiffs a throw, you'll have plenty of time to respond to their blunder. It's one thing to know how to evade a throw, but it might also be helpful to know when your opponent cannot throw. If your opponent is turned around, they cannot throw until they're facing you. And if your opponent is sidestepping, they're able to link their sidestep into sidestep P, sidestep K, and sidestep body dives, but they'll have to wait until they've come to a complete standstill to grab. This means versus characters whose sidestep Ps can't break barriers like Bark, Amy, and Espio, it's often safe to simply keep your barrier up while they're sidestepping. I still personally like going for the occasional throw after a sidestep. Yeah, I'm just quirky like that, I guess. Another spot for players to look for throws in this game is on Wake Up. When getting up from a knockdown, you can input a throw, and the animation of your character getting up will, in essence, mask the startup frames of your throw, meaning your character can pretty much wake up and immediately hit a throw if they're in range and their opponent is in a grabbable state. On the other hand, if you've knocked down your opponent, throwing opponents who just got up can also be a strong read, especially if you expect your opponent to wake up sidestep or wake up barrier.
Oh, get absolutely red. Respectfully.
With all of this in mind, just remember that jumping and crouching will often save you from an unsavory situation in this game. Although even if you do jump or crouch an opponent who's inputting a throw, you might still end up getting hit by something. One complaint that I'll hear from new players a lot in Sonic the Fighters is that the grab input doesn't seem to work properly. You'll try to throw, and instead you'll punch. But here's the thing, this so-called typo punch is, believe it or not, an intended mechanic. Basically, if you input a throw while your opponent is in an ungrabbable state, the grab will become a punch instead. This can obviously be pretty annoying. Just because your opponent is not in a grabbable state when you input a throw does not mean that they necessarily would still be in that ungrabbable state 14 frames later when your throw became active. Thankfully, there is a way to circumvent typo punch. One basic answer here is to hold down when you grab. This will make sure that you're always grabbing when you input punch and barrier. Although against Fang, Amy, and Bean, as well as Espio, it does mean that you will end up using weapon grab. Weapon grabs are a series of command grabs that involve taking a character's weapon and using it against them that all of the game's smaller-bodied characters can use. And while they do have their uses, some of them do not end in knockdowns, unlike many characters' default grabs. And they often also do less damage as well, meaning that if possible, you might want to avoid using a weapon grab depending on the matchup and what character you play. So I actually made a whole other section of this video explaining more of the details of how you can take advantage of typo punch by using it as a sort of option select that will grab your opponents if they're grabbable and punch them if they're not. But honestly, if you just play around with your grabs, you'll probably figure this out on your own, so I felt like I didn't really need to go into it too much. Instead, let's talk about the wall. Ever since the Vega fight from Street Fighter II, game developers have pondered one question. What if fighting, but on walls? The answer to that question might just be Sonic the Fighters. In STF, great players will distinguish themselves from good players by maximizing their use of the game's 3 wall options. The simplest of these options may be what is known as Wall Rocket. This move can be a little finicky to set up, but if your character is directly aligned with the back of a wall, hold back and press kick to push your character off of it like an Olympic swimmer. Classified as an attack, this can be a surprisingly solid offensive option that also comes with the added benefit of getting you out of the corner. SEF's other wall-based mechanics are a little bit more complex. First, let's talk about wall climbing. Initiating a wall climb is pretty easy. Simply run face first into a wall and your character will climb it. Once they reach the top, they'll have a cornucopia of options to take while dismounting. You can use 8 different 45-degree angles to influence the way your character jumps or drops off the wall from there, or use punch or kick inputs to launch off with attacks. If players press punch, kick, and block while coming off of a wall, they can also jump off in a way that homes in towards their opponent. Running into a wall is the easiest way to climb it, but you can also climb a wall out of a jump by pressing punch, barrier, and kick while you collide with it. Wall jumping works similarly. By jumping diagonally towards a wall, players will bounce off of it, at which point they can use the 8 recognized directions of an arcade joystick, or no direction input at all, in order to choose between 9 different angles of wall jumps. By pressing punch or kick while wall jumping, you can also launch yourself towards the opponent. From both wall jumps and descending from wall climbs, players are actionable as if they had jumped. Meaning on their descent, they have access to options like kicks, air spins, air punches, and hyper start if they so choose. Players can take advantage of the wall to help run out the clock, to reposition, to attack opponents, or to bait them into attacking. Climbing the wall can be especially beneficial because by putting you in a rising state, it makes you immune to all attacks classified as lows and mids, which includes all throws and the majority of kicks. That said, air kicks can be used as a callout for players who are climbing the wall, and if a climbing player is hit by air kicks, they may just lose the round right there. Anyway, yeah, that's all I got for now. That makes up most of the bigger things I wanted to go through in this video, but STF has a lot of weird stuff in it that I didn't go over, so maybe we'll do a follow-up later. I don't know. This video could not have been possible without the work of STF's data miners, labbers, and players. Special thanks go to Beta Relics, Puppyluvv, KOS, and Mystic Noodle, whose writing on wall options and teching were the basis for the sections on those subjects in this video. Hopefully I didn't get too much wrong. If you want to see more STF content, there's a surprising amount out there. I have to recommend Mystic Noodle's channel, as his task videos show what the upper limits of this game could look like, and they're also really funny. If you want to watch people play the game, definitely check out Sonic Arena on YouTube, which has most of the official Discord tournaments on it. STF mainstay Lots of Money has also uploaded a lot of casual sessions to YouTube featuring players of a variety of skill levels. Finally, I've made a few STF videos myself, one of which being a long-form documentary looking at the game's competitive history, another one being more of a silly doc looking at the history of one of the game's most misunderstood characters. You can support me by going to ko-fi.com/woostunes, coffee.com/woostunes, however you say it, and becoming a one-time or recurring donor. There's some exclusive content on there, as well as early access to videos. You can also become a channel member. Big thanks to Will S., St. October Original Soundtrack, Seek Plus, Anonymous, and Heart Eyes Emoji for your support on Ko-fi.